we actually begin the story? We've heard about fiscal policy, we've just listened to ESCOM, but I think the crux of the matter is we have seen a heap of GDP downgrades yet again in South Africa, and it's only February, right? And the problem is that for a decade, this has been a consistent, persistent trend. And the upward sloping GDP outlook has also been something that didn't really materialize, okay? And this has created problems for fiscal policy in itself. But is it really real GDP we care about? Or is it nominal GDP? And if it is nominal GDP, because that's really what determines revenue in the budget, how do we get it right? Who wants to start? Mamokete? Marie?
Susie, you answered quite a few of the questions, sort of in your questions. So from an economic perspective, from a macro perspective, we care about the output. We care about real GDP. Is the economy growing in output terms? And what does that mean for per capita incomes? And what does it mean for the people who live in that economy? But nominal counts for the fiscal, as you say, right? And in fact, it is this decade-long deterioration in both real and nominal. If you look at a chart, the staggered downward adjustment in both of those indicators, accelerated particularly on the nominal side by some revisions quite recently, that has compounded the challenge. So in fact, on a personal level, we care about the real, and on a fiscal level, we care about the nominal, and you combine them, and both affect us in very different ways. But the reality that we're sitting with now is this slow deterioration in both, but the fiscal challenges on the nominal side.
Where is your real GDP growth forecast here?
Yeah. I'm sitting at about 0.9, which is on the optimistic side. And my reason for that is twofold. While there's clear downside risk from load shedding, and I'm sure we're going to get to what is the cost of load shedding at some point. I know that the CSIR has put out documents, and various other research houses have as well, is that we have we're coming off such a low base. And we have low capacity utilization. So even where we have this sustained period of stage load shedding, what we see in the absolute numbers in the short term is quite difficult to say, we had terrible load shedding this quarter, and look what happened, boom, 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 you see all the indicators adjust. And the reason for this is, particularly outside of mining, you're able to, you delay output, you delay consumption, and you adjust around it. And so there is a very obvious, very short-term impact that we can measure and then extrapolate across the economy. The long-term impact is very clear. So to my forecast, I think there's very big downside risk. We've had to revise ourselves into a technical recession because Q4 looks like it's going to be negative, and the early run data for Q1, which has a statistically large footprint in your annual GDP, looks very weak and very concerning. The reason I am hanging on to a little bit of hope is that I do think some of the momentum as we went into the early stages of Q4 looked a bit better. I think the gross fixed capital formation numbers in Q3 were a little bit better. And I think that we could get a very welcome tailwind potentially from terms of trade and global trade picking up in the second part of the year. So I'm holding on to a little bit of optimism. But if you had to put my neck on a block, I'd say we're probably going to be lucky to squeak out 0.5% this year on a current baseline.
And Mamokete, if I've had to bring this through to the pressing next week budget, what are your expectations from Tito Mboweni?
Oh my gosh. Wow.
I'm so glad not to be asked that question.
How did I end up with that one? Oh my
How do you
word.
find a Michael with that one?
No, the question is how do I land?
Well, do you expect the budget to deteriorate from the MTBPS, or do you expect it to improve? Let's start on the headlines.
So let me, I'm going to go way back because it's easier to do that. So to contextualize, I think I grew up in financial markets in the 2000s, late 2000s, mid 2000s. And we'd gotten quite used to budgets that were very predictable. You could almost say, okay, fine, this is what the numbers are going to look like. This is where they're going to fall short. This is what they're going to tweak. And there was a high level of predictability around how fiscal policy was set. Well, the past 5 years have been totally different and actually getting worse with each statement, I would say. So if you go back to, say, the MTBPS when Malusi was finance minister, I think that's the first sort of shock, the first one where you looked at this and said, well, these guys are completely predictable. I don't know what I'm going to expect or what I should reasonably be able to expect from one policy statement to the next. And beyond that, we haven't really had much of an improvement. Firstly, the underlying environment, I think, has deteriorated a lot faster than what we thought. Like last year was hell. Just from one MTBPS to the other, I think your fiscal deficit projections were out by about 2.5 percentage points, which is unprecedented. I mean, we went from 4.5 to 7, basically. So I think what I'm trying to say is the environment has become much, much more difficult to predict. And I think that's where it ties in, for instance, with what Michael said this morning and what we heard from the guys that were talking about the political economy, that when policy setting is as unpredictable as it is, and it's being set everywhere, then it's anybody's guess. So that is my caveat. So in terms of what I predict, so that if I'm wildly out, then you're like, oh, but she did say. So in terms of what I would expect, so under normal circumstances, you would expect that given the deterioration in the fiscus last year and the failure or refusal or, the lack of policy making in response in the MTBPS, and the promise that we would see something in the budget, that the budget would show us better numbers than what we saw in the MTBPS. So the fiscal deficit number for this year, for the coming fiscal year, I think, was 6.8%. That's the prediction. I would expect that would be better. In terms of what the driver of that improvement could be, so one of the proposals that has come out of our house specifically, or our research team, is that there's potentially VAT. And the reason we talk about VAT is because it's one of the levers that I think is available for Treasury for next year. That's one of the few levers that they can pull quite quickly and get a response quite quickly. So if you actually want to see a response in the fiscal numbers for FY 2021, that's probably one of the bigger ones that you can pull. But I think that the risk around that materializing are quite high because the political environment is actually quite fluid, and I think the resistance to the last VAT increase might weigh against that. So in terms of what else they could do, it just means that on the whole, there isn't a lot that one can see that they can do to improve the picture in the short term. So this is my long way of saying marginally better, but it doesn't change the story completely. And definitely, I mean, that's one thing that we haven't spoken about is around credit ratings. So essentially, I don't think you're going to see a fiscal response now that is sufficient to deal with the concerns that are being raised by credit rating agencies. And as a consequence, the likelihood that we get downgraded remains very, very high.
So Wayne, just to pull in something that you said to me, the bottom always looks terrible.
Yep.
The top always looks fantastic.
Yep.
Are we at the bottom?
Well, I hope so. Just a small
Looks terrible.
just a small qualification. I'm not an economist.
Yes, I said macro-minded people.
I'm an accountant. Look, as long as you believe that markets and economies are cyclical, they always have been. Everything is cyclical. My experience is when you're at the top of the cycle, and there's plenty of examples. Us in 2007 were growing 5%. In fact, we were growing so fast we ran out of electricity. You know, the good times were going to go on. Housing prices were going up all the time. There was no end to the good news, and it ended. But at the time, you don't see any bit of bad news on the horizon. Now you talk to anyone, no one can see any light at the end of the tunnel. There's nothing that's going to turn the economy up. We're just going to carry on in this 0.5%, 1% terrible state, and unemployment's going up, and everyone who's got money is going to leave the country, and you just perpetuate this negative spiral. Now, I don't know what's going to turn things up, but from this base level, you don't actually need all that much. Inflation's under control for all the wrong reasons, because there's no demand, but inflation's under control. The Reserve Bank, they've got growth estimates that are probably too high. They're going to have to revise them down. Their own model says another 2/4 point percentage cuts. We could get another full percentage cut. And you add that in, maybe the rand stays a bit stable. There's a lot of bad news already in the price on junk. I mean, we are going to go junk status. It's just a question of 27th of March or November. But that's in the market. There's not one person who doesn't know about junk status and the probability of it happening. So you would assume that a lot has been priced. mean, our bonds are very favorably rated on a yield basis compared to other countries that are junk status. Our listed property market, we haven't seen yields like this since the late 90s. Our South African retail shares, our banking shares, South African orientated shares, their valuations aren't quite there yet, but they're almost as bad as what it was at the height of the global financial crisis. So there's a lot of bad news in the price. So all that's got to happen is the future for South Africa doesn't have to be good. It must just be better than the most recent past. And it's such a low base, it's actually not that hard to beat. A lot of positive things.
We're scraping the bottom of the
Yeah,
barrel,
I'm being super optimistic here. A lot of positive things have happened. We mustn't forget that. You know, we haven't got Malusi Gigaba or Des van Rooyen as finance minister. Praveen's back in it, okay? Every single senior position in all the big SOEs has changed. People are gone. They are gone. No one can argue. You can argue whether the new ANC is doing a good job, but you can't argue that they're doing a better job than the Zuma ANC. You just can't argue that. They are doing a better job. Whether it's a good enough job is another debate. So there's a lot of things in place and a lot of things have improved. And, you know, maybe something happens overseas that derails everything. That's not impossible. But we almost priced for disaster. Look at our financial markets. As I've said, we priced for disaster. So it doesn't take much. Maybe stable rand, maybe interest rate cuts, maybe when the junk status comes, the markets actually rally. Because markets are strange things. When bad news is behind you, it's okay, it's happened, it's done. You know, so things can get better. But you know, just to come back to the first point is, when you're at the bottom and you're in the pits of depression, you cannot see a single thing that's ever for the eternity going to lift you out of that. But it does happen. Things are cyclical.